Hey everybody! In this video, we are going to talk about different ways that we can create value in an artwork using a variety of different techniques. To get started, I have just a really simple set of supplies. I've got my trusty school pencil. I don't need anything really fancier than that for this, because honestly, the key to getting good values is really controlling your pencil. It's not having fancy supplies, it's knowing how to use the supplies that you have. So regular pencil, regular eraser. I've got I've got a kneaded eraser. This is good for erasing areas of shading. And then I have a blending stump, which is basically just a tightly rolled piece of paper. So to get started, we are going to talk about hatching. So hatching is created by a series of parallel lines. So they could be vertical, they could be horizontal, they could be curved, but they just don't intersect with one another. So as I'm creating a value scale, so going from light to dark, I am going to focus on a few different things with hatching. So first off, I'm going to start by pressing very lightly onto the page to create my lightest values. And then as I begin to get darker, I can start to press harder, and I can also start to put my lines a little bit closer together. So if I were to look at my marks from further away, marks that are close to one another appear darker. Marks that are further away from one another appear lighter. The same goes for the thickness of the mark. So if the mark is very thin, it is going to appear to be very light. If a mark is very thick, it's going to appear to be very dark. So as you can see, I'm pushing harder as I get darker, which creates a thicker line, and then my lines also are getting closer together. So now that I'm getting to this point, how can I make this even darker? Well, that will be by making even thicker lines. So I'm going to start doubling up my lines. And then as my marks begin to get even darker, I'm going to start tripling my lines to make them even thicker. All right, so there we have a value scale using hatching. So let's see how this works when creating a form. So on a sphere, when I am doing hatching, I could do straight lines if I wanted to. It's going to be harder to create the illusion of a three-dimensional object with flat lines in this case. So I'm going to use curved lines, but they're still going to be parallel. So again, very light, very thin lines that are kind of further apart in the areas that are lighter. My lines are going to start getting thicker and a little closer together as the shadows begin to build. All right, so there we have a sphere with hatching. When I do my shadows, I'm going to do very close together hatch marks to kind of describe the shape of the shadow. And there you have it. The next type of technique that we're going to talk about is cross hatching. So, like the name implies, we're going to hatch and then we're going to cross over it. So it's a series of intersecting lines that again could be vertical and horizontal, it could be diagonal, it could be kind of curved, or a combination of the two. So I find that cross-hatching helps describe forms a little more easily than hatching does, because we can kind of describe the third dimension a little bit more easily. So along the same lines as the hatching, I'm going to start by just very lightly hatching and then getting a little bit heavier as I go. I'm just going to do a little bit at a time. So from here, then I can go across the form, and I'm going to start lightly and then slowly get darker. So again, the same technique for this is we can vary pressure, but we can also vary distance. So we can put our lines further apart or closer together in order to show value. So for example, if I need this to be a little bit lighter, what I can do is I can just like erase out some of these lines and just give it a little bit of an absence, if you will, and just kind of lighten up just small sections of it. And that might help lighten up the value a little bit to give it a little more of a lightening as we go along. So as we get darker, I think in addition to pressing harder, I'm going to start putting my lines a little closer together. So the key for practicing these things is to practice getting a smooth transition of value. Because if you're able to do that in a practice thing like this, it's going to be easier to do it when you are shading an actual object. All right, so now that we have our value scale going from light to dark, we can translate that to a form. So I'm going to kind of start the same way that I did this first circle, and I am going to kind of follow along the curve of my form, and then lighten up as I get towards where the light would be hitting my object. Obviously, I am making up where the light is hitting my object as it's going from two different sources from sphere to sphere here. But as I have this developed, then in order to create my cross-hatching, in this case, because I'm creating a form, it's called a cross-contour line. So I'm going across the form in a curve, and that is going to help define its roundness. I'm following the shape of it as I go. And in doing so, that helps create a sense of volume. All right, so that would be an example of cross-hatching. And we are on to our third shading technique, which is scribbling or scumbling. It's a fancy term for it. But before we get to that, if you're like me and have a habit of smearing your drawing with the side of your hand, being left-handed, this is my life, a quick tip. Take a scrap piece of paper and set it where your hand is so that your hand rests on top of it. That way your hand is rubbing against the scrap paper and not against your drawing so that you don't have this issue. This will protect your drawing and protect your hand. Very helpful tip. So scribbling is just as the name implies. We're not aiming for really any specific type of mark. It's just very loose and creates kind of a more chaotic feel to it. So to get started with that, I'm going to just lightly make marks. So again, the further apart your marks are, the lighter they will be. The lighter you are pressing with your pencil, the lighter your marks will be. So as I start to create darker values, I'm pressing a little harder and my marks are getting closer together. So that went quickly. So basically the main difference between scribbling and scumbling, scumbling is when your marks are a lot closer together and a little more tightly combined, whereas scribbling, you're going to be a little bit more loose. So it's They're similar in the method in which you are laying the marks down, but they are only different just really in sort of the intention of them. You know, scumbling can be just used to create texture, whereas scribbling can be more of like a loose gestural form. All right, so let's make our sphere in the Scribble Scumble method. So to work with the Scribble method on the sphere, I'm going to start by just very lightly and loosely scribbling around the form. And as I get closer to where I'd like my shadow to be, I am starting to press harder and create marks that are closer together. Now the hard part about this is staying inside the lines while also scribbling. Kind of an oxymoron there. Okay, so as I create my dark scribble marks in the core shadow, I am going to kind of go back up into the middle values and just slowly lighten up a little to help transition everything more gently. Then when it comes to the shadow, I still want it to appear like it is flat on the page. So when I'm scribbling, I'm going to maintain sort of a parallel or like a horizontal primarily mark or scribble. And that's going to help it appear flat and not like it's coming off of the paper. That's just a trick of perspective that will kind of help you as you work. So the more you observe your objects, the easier it is to kind of know what direction your mark should go to help show volume. So there we go, a scribbled sphere. Our next item is probably what I would say the most important skill to learn when it comes time to shade, and that will be shading smoothly with just your pencil. So no other tools. And this is really a matter of control. Can you control your pencil enough to create a smooth mark and a smooth transition of value? So I'm going to be holding my pencil pretty loosely, so you can see how it's kind of sitting in the palm of my hand like this. That allows me to really, really lighten up the pressure so that I am barely touching the page. I'm just like whispering my pencil against it, just a breath across the page. So with this method, the aim is to try to not show any specific pencil marks, but to just show like kind of a smooth range of values without any specific marks. So this is all about control. I'm using the side of the graphite, which gives it kind of a softer, broader mark. I could literally do this with a mechanical pencil too. It would just take me a lot longer. But yeah, the method is really all in controlling your pencil and understanding how it works and understanding like what kind of mark you're making and the placement of it. So I'm moving in sort of short oblong motions, so kind of circular, like if I were to open it up a little bit more, I'm like moving like this, but they're very, very close together. So it's not straight up and down, it's kind of still circular. And then as I start to get darker, I'm pressing harder and I'm kind of going back and forth over those areas just a little more to build up my values. So in this method, we want to kind of layer our graphite to build it up. And I will say, holding my pencil like this, the harder I have to push, the harder it is to hold it like this. So eventually I'm going to have to switch my grip, which can sometimes be difficult to maintain the same delicacy of marks, but again, good skill to have. So what I'm going to do is, this is about as heavy as I can push my value while still holding my pencil on its side like this. So I'm just going to kind of lay uh, an area of value down with this, and then I'm going to switch my grip and go over the top of it with another layer. Okay, so now I'm going to switch my grip, stretch that wrist out. It's tiring. Okay, so even though I'm holding my pencil in writing style again, um, it's vital that I'm still using the side of my pencil and not the tip, because I've built up this kind of flat area that's working really nicely for me. So I still want to use that area as I build up my values. So I'm going to start at the dark end. And I'm still really holding my pencil off to the side. That's still very important. Another thing you want to be aware of is when you're working on the side like this, you want to make sure that you're not scratching the paper with the side of the wood. So what I like to do is I can start to feel when it gets close to that point, and I just kind of slightly rotate my pencil just a little bit to move to a new edge. And then I'm just going to slowly lighten up on the pressure as I move out this way to create my transition. All right, so that feels like a good value scale. So let's do our sphere. All right, so just like I did at the start, I'm going to use the side of my pencil. I'm holding it loosely again to start with. And I want to kind of go across and around the form. So it's almost like a mixture of cross-hatching and blending at this point as we get started. So you can also notice how I'm holding my pencil now. I've kind of scooted up on it a little bit, and that allows me just a little bit more control over the edge of my pencil. I like to call this a sketch grip. It works just as well as the other side, but allows me to put just a little bit more pressure on it. And as I get up towards the top, I'm going to just really start to lighten up on my pressure so that I'm barely touching the page. Again, very whisper soft. And there we go. So now we'll add our shadow. So there we have a smooth technique with just our pencil. And the last technique that I'm going to show you is using a blending stump. So basically, we're going to do the same thing that we did with the smooth, but then add a blending stump on top of it. So I'm going to begin with my very light marks and then just slowly build up my volume. So a lot of people, when they first start using blending stumps, tend to think that the blending stump will do all the work for them and make their stuff magically smooth. That is not the case. If you scribble with a blending stump, you're literally just going to get a fuzzy scribble when you're done. So for example, if I, scribbled with my pencil and then decided I wanted to try and smooth it, you're still going to see that scribble, right? It's still not going to look that great. So it's important that you take care with your blending to create a smooth transition and smooth mark making if you want your blending stump to work well and create a smooth area of value for you. So you got to do the work. It won't do it for you. All right, so once we have our layers of value built up, we'll start blending. So as you can see, I've already used my blending stump and it's got some pretty heavy marks on it. So that's actually going to leave a lot of dark on the page. And if I'm over here, I really don't want that to happen. So I want to use an area that doesn't have really much of anything. So when I use my blending stump, I use the tip if I'm doing details, but if I am working in larger areas, I use the side of it. So you can see how I've kind of worked down the side of the edge. And that is what I want you to do as well. So we're going to use the side and we're going to just very gently press into the graphite and kind of work in circular motions. And I'm just kind of going back and forth and back and forth in these circular motions to smooth out the marks. So even with as smooth of the marks that I've created with the pencil, you can still see them through the blending stump. So the smoother you can get them, the better this will be for you. Any scribbles will definitely show up and it will not look that great. If your entire blending stump is totally covered with graphite and you need a fresh area, one suggestion that I would give you is to take a piece of fine sandpaper and you can just kind of scrape the side of your blending stump to remove excess graphite off of it, and then you should have a nice new sort of sheet to work with as you go. Another thing to note when you are working with the blending stump is it tends to pick up graphite too. So not only does it smear it and sort of blend it, in the darker areas especially, it likes to pick up sections of graphite. So sometimes areas that you have shaded really, really dark are not so dark when you finish. So you might need to go back in and add some additional layers. And as you can see, I've really picked up a lot of graphite here as it's crumbled around me. So from here, this isn't as dark as I really want it to be, so I'm going to go back over it again with my pencil and lay down another layer of graphite to push things down. Now, if you feel like you've layered and layered and layered and it is still not as dark as you want it to be, you could use a workable fixative, which is like a spray that sets your graphite so it doesn't smear around and doesn't lift off as much. And that creates what we call a tooth on the paper, which gives it a little extra grip so that you can go back over it and keep layering. Now, I know some of you more fine artists will probably hate me for saying this, but when you're in a real pinch, and I'm only going to say this if you're working like on sketches and not anything professional, but if you're in a real pinch and you're at home and you don't have workable fixative, aerosol hairspray works very well. It is not archival. It is not, good for the longevity of your artwork. So if it's just in your sketchbook and you're just practicing, go ahead and use it. But if it's like something you're going to put in a gallery or like hang on your wall forever, go buy some fixative. I know all the cheap drawing hacks from growing up because I didn't have an art supply store around me. Work with what you have, All right, so now we have this nice, very smooth mark. So let's do our final sphere. So same as blending, we're going to just create our areas of value, moving in those sort of oblong marks, going around the form. Another good tip is if you find that maybe your area is too dark and you don't have enough light, you can take your kneaded eraser and shape it into whatever shape you want. And I just like to dab it over the top of areas of value. And that just really gently lightens things up for me. I do a little dab and twist, if you will. And that technique seems to work really nicely for me as I lighten up areas. So maybe I just got a little excited, need to chill out a little bit. And that really helps create a little more value. So I am going to start working around my form. So again, I can take that kneaded eraser to erase out areas that still need a highlight. If it gets totally full of graphite, you can stretch it to refresh it, which is also a great stress reliever. I highly encourage it. So continuing to move in sort of that circular motion helps push the graphite around the page so that it stays nice and smooth. So there you have it. We have a variety of different ways of creating value using different marks. So hatching, cross-hatching, scribble or scumble, smooth pencil work, and pencil with a blending stump. Practice hard, keep working. Thanks for watching and keep creating.